Imagine waking up on a freezing January morning, checking the news, and discovering that migrants are still crossing the English Channel in sub-zero temperatures whilst the government announces plans to spend hundreds of millions of pounds building brand new council homes specifically to house them. Meanwhile, 1.3 million British citizens languish on social housing waiting lists, watching this unfold with understandable fury. Welcome to 2026, where the small boat crisis has morphed into what Nigel Farage is now calling the era of the Starmer boats, and the political temperature is somehow even hotter than the channel waters are cold. Quick favor, if you're enjoying this content, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and genuinely helps us keep bringing you these stories. Cheers if you did. Right. Let us dive straight into this absolute political maelstrom. So here's where things stand. GB News has exclusively revealed that the first wave of small boat migrants of 2026 has already made it to British shores, crossing the channel in temperatures that would make a polar bear think twice. Around 36 illegal migrants reached the United Kingdom just days after it was revealed that 2025's total reached an absolutely staggering 41,427 people. That is not a small town. That is a decently sized town's worth of people who cross one of the world's busiest shipping lanes in inflatable dinghies. Let that sink in for a moment. Speaking on GB News, Nigel Farage dropped what might be the most politically charged observation of the young year. Britain is now fewer than 200 arrivals away from Sir Keir Starmer becoming the Prime Minister under whom the most migrants have crossed the English Channel ever in history. Think about that. Despite all the tough rhetoric, despite the promises to smash the gangs, despite the international agreements and the millions spent on enforcement, we are on the brink of a new record under a Labour government that campaigned on fixing this very issue. The irony is so thick you could spread it on toast. Farage has started calling them the Starmer boats, which is politically brutal and rather effective branding. Actually, it is a direct callback to the term Tory boats that Labour supporters used when Conservatives were in power, turning Labour's own rhetorical weapon straight back at them. In politics, what goes around absolutely comes around, usually with interest. But here is where things get genuinely fascinating, and this is a part that might surprise you. Of all the people claiming asylum in Britain, only around 40% arrived by small boat. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that correctly. For all the media attention, parliamentary debates, and political hand-wringing focus on channel crossings, they represent less than half the asylum seekers entering the country. So where's everyone else coming from? Well, according to Farage, others are arriving in the backs of lorries. Apparently, there's even an advertisement circulating on TikTok providing instructions on how to accomplish this feat, complete with simple drills showing how easy it is to reach the United Kingdom. We are living in an era where people's smuggling tips are being shared on the same platform teenagers used to learn dance routines and cooking hacks. What a time to be alive. Farage admitted he personally would not be keen on running along and jumping into a lorry, but acknowledged that if he were 18 and fit, it probably would not seem terribly difficult. Fair assessment, really. Now here's the biggest part of the equation that often gets overlooked in the small boats hysteria. The largest issue, according to Farage and various immigration analysts, is people arriving from Pakistan and elsewhere on legitimate visas, then overstaying and subsequently claiming asylum. This is the invisible part of the migration crisis, the bit that does not generate dramatic footage of boats being intercepted by border force, but numerically represent a massive chunk of the problem. It is like focusing on the visible tip of an iceberg whilst ignoring the enormous mass lurking beneath the surface. Either way, as Farage correctly points out, Britain has a massive problem and a government that claims to be committed to reducing the number of migrants in hotels. Except here's the awkward bit. There are more migrants in hotels today than there were when Labour won power on July the 4th last year. That is not exactly the trajectory you want if your entire immigration pitch was that you would handle this better than the other lot. It is rather like a football manager promising to fix a defense and then conceding more goals than the previous gaffer. But wait, because it gets even more politically explosive. The latest government scheme involves spending hundreds of millions of pounds purchasing brand new council homes to house people who cross the channel or arrived in lorries. Brighton, Hove, Hackney, Peterborough, and Thanet have all agreed to participate. Now, Let us pause and consider the optics here for a moment. Brand new council homes, not refurbished properties, not temporary accommodation. Brand new homes, being purchased specifically to house asylum seekers, whilst 1.3 million British citizens sit on social housing waiting lists, some of them waiting years for suitable accommodation. Farage nailed the political reality when he said this is a kind of story that creates a sense of total unfairness at every level when it reaches the British public. And honestly, regardless of where you stand on immigration policy, it is rather difficult to argue with that assessment. Imagine you are a young British family, living in overcrowded private rental accommodation, desperately waiting for social housing so your children can have their own bedrooms. You have been on the waiting list for 3 years. You follow the rules, you pay your taxes, you contribute to society. Then you discover the government is buying brand new homes for people who enter the country illegally whilst you continue waiting. The sense of injustice would be absolutely overwhelming. This is precisely the political ammunition that Reform UK and other immigration hawks need, and they are absolutely seizing it with both hands. Lee Anderson, Reform UK's chief whip, told GB News there was little surprise migrants continued to make the journey, accusing the government of actively rewarding illegal crossings. His language was characteristically blunt. He called the government spineless and treacherous, claiming this invasion will never end under Labour's watch. Strong words, but they resonate with a significant chunk of the electorate who feel utterly betrayed by successive governments' failure to control borders. Anderson added that communities will continue suffering the consequences, with the cost ultimately borne by decent, hard-working Brits. It is populist rhetoric, certainly, but populism tends to gain traction when people feel the establishment has stopped listening to their legitimate concerns. And let us be honest, when you are telling British citizens on housing waiting lists that hundreds of millions of pounds are being spent on new homes for illegal migrants, you are handing political opponents an absolutely golden attack line. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp also piled in, criticising the government and warning that the latest crossing showed ministers have no control of our borders whatsoever. He pointed out that the Prime Minister himself had admitted there was no effective deterrent in place, which rather explains why illegal migration continues at scale. Philp insisted the only solution was leaving the European Convention on Human Rights and deporting all illegal migrants within a week of arrival, claiming that approach would bring crossings to an end. Whether that is legally or practically feasible is debatable, but it certainly sounds decisive, which is often half a battle in politics. Now, Sir Keir Starmer is not sitting quietly through all this criticism. In his first cabinet meeting of 2026, the Prime Minister issued a defiant statement insisting the United Kingdom will turn a corner this year on several matters, including the migrant crisis. But his rhetoric took an interesting turn. Rather than focusing purely on policy solutions, Starmer framed this as an existential political battle. He presented the choices between a Labour government renewing the country or a reform movement that feeds on grievance, decline, and division. His characterization of reform was particularly sharp. He accused them of wanting a weaker state, injecting bile into communities, and wanting to appease Putin. That last bit is a reference to Nigel Farage's more sympathetic comments about understanding Russia's security concerns regarding NATO expansion, which have proven politically controversial. Starmer called this the fight of our political lives, one that Labour must relish. He acknowledged the scale of the task, but insisted his team had the necessary belief in nerve. Governments do not lose because polls go down, he argued. They lose when they lose belief or nerve. We will do neither, he declared. It is stirring stuff, the kind of rallying cry designed to energize a cabinet that has endured a rather bruising few months. But here's the problem with stirring rhetoric. It does not stop boats. It does not house British families on waiting lists. It does not solve the fundamental mathematical problem that Britain cannot indefinitely accommodate everyone who wants to come here while simultaneously providing adequate services to existing residents. Inspiration is lovely, but people want results. The political dynamics here are absolutely fascinating. Labour is trapped in a bind of their own making. They correctly identified that the Conservative approach to immigration was not working. They promised to smash the criminal gang facilitating crossings through enhanced international cooperation, rather than the Rwanda scheme they derided as an expensive gimmick. But months into power, the boats keep coming, the numbers keep climbing, and they are now facing the same criticism they lobbed at Conservatives. Meanwhile, they are implementing policies like buying new social housing for asylum seekers that are politically toxic with exactly the working-class voters Labour desperately needs to retain. Reform UK, meanwhile, is positioned perfectly to capitalise on this mess. They can point to the continuing crisis as evidence that the establishment parties, whether red or blue, are fundamentally incapable of controlling immigration. They can claim only their more radical solutions, leaving the ECHR, mass deportations, turning boats back at sea, will actually work. Whether those policies are practical, legal, or moral is almost beside the point politically. They sound decisive, and in politics, perception often matters more than reality. The Conservative Party finds itself in the odd position of criticizing Labour for a crisis they themselves failed to solve during 14 years in power. Chris Phil can demand leaving the ECHR all he likes, but voters might reasonably ask why Conservatives did not do that when they had the chance. Political memory is inconveniently long sometimes. What is absolutely clear is that this issue is not going away. The first boats of 2026 have already arrived. More will follow. The weather will improve, the crossings will increase, and the political pressure will intensify. Every arrival feeds a narrative that Britain has lost control of its borders. Every pound spent housing asylum seekers whilst British families wait for social housing fuels resentment. Every political promise to fix the problem that goes unfulfilled erodes trust in the entire system. The tragedy underneath all this political theatre is that there are no easy answers. The global displacement crisis is enormous. War, persecution, and poverty drive millions to seek better lives. Britain's geographic position, language, economic opportunities, and historical connections make it an attractive destination. Criminal gangs have industrialized people smuggling. International law constrains what governments can legally do. The English Channel is treacherous, and allowing people to drown is morally unacceptable to most Britons even if they oppose illegal immigration.